Because as Napoleon said about China years ago, he said, China, there is a sleeping giant. Let it sleep. Let it sleep, because when it wakes, it will move the world. And it's moving the world now. And it's very important that the relationship we have with China be developed into a very productive one. And that trip is what started what we hope will be an ongoing productive relationship with China. Of course, then there was the 73 Yom Kippur War, where Israel was surprised by the armies of Egypt, and the armies of Egypt gained a very significant advantage and knocked out a lot of the Israeli equipment. And it was President Nixon, against the advice of Kissinger and Schlesinger, he said that we're not going to let Israel go down the tubes. And he ordered the planes to get off the tarmacs with the resupply of equipment for Israel. In Israel, Golda Meir, knowing the equipment was on the way, then went on the attack, and of course the Egyptian armies were soon beaten and trapped in the southern Sinai. At that point, about a week and a half later, President Nixon went to Sadat and said, stop. Went to Golda Meir and said, stop. You're not going to do this to Sadat. You have to save face for Sadat. And so at that point, there was a stalemate. Sadat saved face. He was seen as a hero. He built up political capital in Egypt, and that led to Sadat's famous visit to Israel at the invitation of Prime Minister Begin later. And that, of course, led to the famous Camp David handshake, an agreement that President Carter presided over, and that led to Oslo I and Oslo II. So in that short period of time, decisions made by President Nixon as President of the United States in managing the relationship with Israel and with Egypt had consequences that went far beyond his administration. And of course, in Vietnam, his bringing about peace with honor in Vietnam was one of the major accomplishments of his administration, and he ended the draft in the process. There are others, the India-Pakistan war, where he saved Pakistan from being dismembered by India, and other accomplishments. But there are also mistakes. And in his later years, President Nixon told me about the mistakes. The two mistakes that he felt were the biggest mistakes of his administration from a policy point of view. On the domestic side, wage price controls. Now, granted, there was an economic theory at the time that you could implement wage price controls quickly and break inflation psychology, and Congress had given to him, dared him, in fact, to use wage price controls. The Democratic Congress wanted to campaign in '72 against him. Inflation is roaring because President Nixon wouldn't use the powers that we gave him. Well, President Nixon did use it, and it was a mistake. It was both a policy mistake, and it was a huge political mistake that resulted in the deep '74 recession that hurt him terribly politically at the same time that he had a scandal going on. In the foreign policy, he regretted that he had not mined Haiphong Harbor and bombed North Vietnam the way he did in 1972 earlier. He thought he could have brought about an end to the Vietnam War earlier if he had been more aggressive in doing that. On that score, I reminded him that I doubt he could have been able to pull off his trip to China under those circumstances, but yet he still felt that that was his biggest mistake in the foreign policy side. As for his successor, President Ford, he had to deal with the huge losses in the '74 elections, overwhelmingly Democratic Congress that had been energized by Watergate. And of course, what were they doing? They wanted big spending programs. And it was very defensive on President Ford's part, but he succeeded in keeping most of those big spending programs from that happening, not just through wielding his veto threat, but also because of his relationships and knowledge, deep knowledge of Congress. And of course, the Mayaguez incident, in which, rather than getting into the details of it, the bottom line was President Ford made the statement, America as a result of the Vietnam War and what happened there is not a pitiless, helpless giant. America will still act to protect its interests and to protect its soldiers and to protect its citizens. And that was a very important statement to be made after the Vietnam War. Where did I fit into all this? At the very start, going way back, my interests were very singular, very simple. One word, Tricia. Tricia. And just a little story, several years ago, I was out at the Bohemian Grove there in encampment. You kind of walk around, you run into a lot of different people. And I had a little group with me, and walking to camp, there was Jerry Brown. He was the Attorney General of California at the time. I was looking at Jerry Brown. He was looking at me and said, hello. I guess he was thinking of something to say. He said, you know, my father, Pat Brown, beat your father-in-law to be governor of California. And I looked back at him and said, yes, I'm glad he did. And then everyone kind of gasped, because if he hadn't beaten him, I wouldn't have met Tricia, because I would have stayed in California. And after that loss, Mr. Nixon got called by his friends in New York, Elmer Bobst and Don Kendall and others who ran companies in the New York area, and said, Dick, you're going to die on the vine out there in California. Come here in New York. You'll be senior partner in our law firm, and you can be a lawyer here, and we'll see what happens from there. And Mr. Nixon did come back, and Tricia went to high school, senior in high school, to my sister's high school, and I met her there in the context of a class dance, and 8 years later, in 1971, we were married. And Mr. Nixon was a lawyer at the time. He argued major cases, Time v. Hill, before the Supreme Court. But he also steadily, step by step, built up in his inimitable determination, built up his political and also his intellectual capital. He went out and campaigned hard for Goldwater after Goldwater became the Republican nominee at the '64 convention. Others didn't do that. Governor Rockefeller sat on his hands. In '66, he went out and did extensive campaigning for Republican congressional candidates all across the country. And that election, Republicans recouped 47 seats, and he got credit for that. But more important, in his domestic travels and his foreign travels, outside of the Washington, D.C. bubble, he encountered the American people and foreign leaders. And he got a sense of the movements that were then moving America, the ones that I just discussed, and sorted out in his mind what should be done, what was a valid grievance and what was not. And abroad in the foreign trips to Europe, to Asia, and to the Mideast, he met old friends like Konrad Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle, who was then president in France, and who incidentally believed that Mr. Nixon would come back to be president of the United States. And in those serious discussions, he saw a different view about China and other foreign policy issues, and developed what he thought America should do and what the president of the United States, next president, should do. For me, again, my interest was Tricia. But during this process, I had glimpses of a great man preparing for a great job. In February of 1968, of course, there was the New Hampshire primary was coming up. Governor Rockefeller tried to smoke out Mr. Nixon on what his plan was to bring about peace in Vietnam and in the world. And so he put out, Nixon's got a secret plan, he won't tell us about it. So there I was in Mr. Nixon's library. He came back from a hard day of campaigning. I was waiting for Tricia to change, and we were there, and I was thinking, well, I'm almost a member of the family. Mr. Nixon, what's your plan? Well, it was very straightforward. I'm going to go to Peking, I'm going to go to Moscow, and that's how we're going to bring peace in Vietnam and in the world. Just think of that. Just think of that. Here as a senior in college at that time, I didn't tell anyone. It was supposed to be secret. He didn't tell anyone, but he had a plan, and he knew what he was going to do. He had built up that intellectual capital of what he would do if he had the opportunity as President of the United States to do it. And then, of course, there was the '68 convention. I learned a lesson about the ad hoc nature of politics there. I was sitting next to Mr. Nixon just after Agnew had been announced as his vice presidential candidate. And he turned to me and said, Eddie, what do you think about Mr. Agnew? He's asking, my reaction. He's asking me. And so I said what I thought was clear evaluation of Mr. Agnew. Agnew had a very dignified presence about himself. And I blurted out, well, sir, he has presence. And good enough. Mr. Nixon then changed, and he had to go out to the convention hall. He went out of the hotel, and of course a press gaggle gathered around him. Well, Mr. Nixon, what do you think about your vice presidential candidate? Well, he's got presence. Whoa. Gotta watch what you say. Well, he barely won at the convention. People don't understand how close it was. I later had a conversation with Ed Meese about it, and Ronald Reagan was a reluctant candidate. If he had he'd only been elected governor of California 2 years before, a little bit like Chris Christie now, and he was really pulled into it by a draft movement. If he had been determined, he might have gotten the nomination because it's basically a Goldwater group of delegates, a Ronald Reagan group of delegates. Of course, Rockefeller was coming from the moderate side of the party. But he did get the nomination. The New Jersey delegation broke apart. And at that point, he won the nomination. The party united behind him. It was a very tough election right at the end. Lyndon Johnson ordered a bombing halt. And I remember 3 a.m. in the morning, after Election Day, it was still up in the air. Walter Cronkite was on TV. This is extraordinary. The electoral votes, the vote in Illinois has not yet been announced. Shades of 1960 happening all over again. Well, Mr. Nixon came in and said, don't worry about it. We're withholding our downstate votes. So Mayor Daley won't know how many votes he needs from the graveyard in order to win. And Mayor Daley at 3 a.m. in the morning finally threw in the towel, and Richard Nixon was then elected next president of the United States. So then the White House days. What was it like, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue? Well, maybe I'll let Prince Charles describe the White House the best. He came for a visit, as you know, and with all the ruffles and flourish of a visit he was not, of course, the head of state, but he was potentially the next head of state, and he came, and the Army band was playing, and the motorcade came up on the south portico, and the family was waiting for Prince Charles there, and he got out of his car and came up to the family, looked at the White House, thinking of something to say, and he said, "My, what a nice little house." And it is a nice little house. It is a little house. It's the president's house. And the president, as opposed to the British system, where they have a head of government, prime minister, who works out of a townhouse, 10 Downing Street. There's a lot of connecting townhouses, but it's right there on a street. And then you've got the head of government, the Queen. The head of state, the Queen, and she lives in Buckingham Palace. Well, the President of the United States is both the head of government and the head of state, and yet he lives in the President's house, which is really a modest house. But it's a little house that has a lot of history, whether it's the Lincoln bedroom with all the ghosts that are supposed to be there, or whether it's the bedroom where Churchill stayed for months when he was in the United States during World War II, working with us as an ally to defeat Hitler. As for me, well, I found a very nice place to work up in the solarium. After I graduated from law school in 1972, I had to pass the bar exam. And let me tell you, failure was not an option. So I parked myself up in that solarium, and for 8 weeks straight, because Harvard Law School does not prepare you to pass bar exams, I worked steadily around the clock. It was a wonderful place to work. I could have books all around, no one disturbed me, and it worked out very well for me. But the White House is more than just a little house. In the American mind, it's a big concept. And along with it goes Camp David. Camp David that President Carter, in his desire to sort of personalize the presidency, he sold off the presidential yachts. He wanted to get rid of Camp David. Mr. Nixon called him and said, "Mr. President, you really don't want to do that." And finally, reason prevailed. Of course, Camp David remained as part of the White House complex. And what is President Carter known for? The Accords of Camp David. A President of the United States needs places like that, where he can work out those things in a different kind of setting than a conference room. Of course, we had the Western White House in San Clemente. President shouldn't just be in Washington, D.C. He needs to be all around the country. And for Mr. Nixon, from Southern California, we had the Western White House, and then there was the Florida White House in Key Biscayne. So what is the White House really? It is the president and the presidency of the president. And I've already addressed a lot of the issues with respect that the President of the United States and Gerald Ford, as the minority leader in the House, had to address. And so perhaps I would like to give you now a family member's view of Richard Nixon, the man. Because after all, it's the man who makes the presidency. Richard Nixon was a great man. Some men are made great by the position that they occupy, and they have the right values, and they make the right decisions, and they deserve that. But from the day I met him until the day he died, whether he was in office or out of office, Mr. Nixon was a great man. You just felt it, you knew it, it's what he was. And how do you explain it? He had a great intellect. Now, I'm not going to call him an intellectual. If I call him intellectual, lightning would strike me right here. Because intellectual he did not respect intellectuals per se. But he had a great intellect, an inquiring intellect, an intellect that thought strategically. I asked Tricia, what was the most, if you had to pick one thing about your father, what was the most important element of the way he thought and worked? And he always thought strategically. He had that kind of mind. He had an acute sense of the shifting political forces in the United States and abroad. He rejected political correctness, accepted wisdom. And so, for example, in the early days after the fall of the Berlin Wall and as the Soviet Union was disintegrating, most of our leaders said, well, we're going with Gorbachev. We're backing him as opposed to Yeltsin. I mean, he dresses well and all that. And President Nixon said, no, Yeltsin is our man. Yeltsin is, now Yeltsin drank too much. He was always disheveled. He didn't necessarily, sometimes he just wasn't capable of going out and doing the ceremonial things he was supposed to do. But Gorbachev, as good as he looked, and as well as he talked, and as much as Margaret Thatcher said, here's a man we can do business with, he was just interested in improving communism. Yeltsin was a real Democrat, lower D, who believed in the values we believed in and wanted Russia to take on those values. And he did that when he became president of Russia. But President Nixon at the time was very concerned with the issues about Russia and democracy in Russia, perceived that, and made it clear and had a huge impact on our foreign policy, saying, no, Yeltsin is our man, because he didn't accept the accepted wisdom of the time. He could communicate plainly. Most people of great intellects have a hard time communicating plainly. And President Nixon, because of his background and what he was, could do that. And he had the courage of his convictions that were well thought out. And that's the most important. If you don't have the value of courage, all the rest doesn't count. Put all those things together, that were the things that characterized Mr. Nixon and made him a great man. And since he liked to think, ideas were more important to him than things. He lived simply. He liked to live in a simple bedroom in Saddle River, New Jersey. His bedroom was very simple and straightforward. He liked to work in a small study with books all around him. He liked the Lincoln sitting room at the White House. Anyone who has seen replicas of it, it's a very small room. That's where he liked to work, with a fire in the fireplace. Even in the summer, turn up the air conditioning, let's have a fire. He liked fires. It helped him think. He liked our library in our apartment in New York City, where he would receive guests as a former president. He lived in Saddle River, New Jersey, so he'd come in, and Tricia would be the hostess to receive his guests there. He liked the hideaway office next to the Oval Office, not the Oval Office, but a little office where he could sit, think, and write. And he had a hideaway in the Executive Office Building, where if he wanted to get out of the West Wing completely. Post-presidency, didn't join any boards, never accepted honorariums. He's the only president to decline Secret Service protection. After it was about 10 years, Mrs. Nixon first gave it up, and then he gave it up. He didn't think the United States government should pay to protect him any longer. And it also was easier for him to travel. He would travel with one individual with him, one assistant. It's easier to get around rather than having 3 shifts of 8 Secret Service agents traveling with you. That horde descending on a foreign country, it makes harder for you to plan your visits and to do them the right way. I, for one, was a beneficiary of that because I often got to travel with him as his assistant. And what did he do for a living? He wrote books, wrote 9 of them, all bestsellers after he left the presidency. But they're all think pieces, and some of them had huge impacts on America's domestic and foreign policy. He made his speeches because he didn't accept honorariums. He made speeches for effect, and he talked to the groups where he wanted to have an effect on the policy of the United States as it was evolving. But Richard Nixon was also a man of action, as well as a man of intellect. And like those first great modern presidents, Teddy Roosevelt and President Wilson, he was also a man of action as well as a man of intellect. And how did he reconcile a man of thought and a man of action? He wrote a book called In the Arena, which I have here. It's one of his bestsellers. It was a very personal book. And of course, he quoted Teddy Roosevelt in it, the man in the arena. And this is a creed he lived by. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, because there is not effort without error and shortcoming, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumphs of high achievement, who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. That's a man of action. But then reflecting on that in this book, in a chapter entitled Thinking, President Nixon wrote, thinking is particularly vital for politicians, whose statements, whether thought through or not, can have enormous consequences both for themselves and other people. As de Gaulle observed, great men of action have always been of the meditative type. They have, without exception, possessed to a very high degree the power of withdrawing into themselves. Too often politics, this is President Nixon writing again, too often politics, the man of thought cannot act, and the man of action does not think. The ideal is one such as Woodrow Wilson, who was a creative thinker and when still at his best, a decisive man of action. Then he quotes a philosopher because he read books on philosophy. Act as men of thought, think as men of action. And he concluded, and this says a lot about him, and he concluded, there's no greater exhilaration than the sense of accomplishment you feel after making a decision based on careful, intense thought. In the end, thinking provides the inner peace and serenity necessary for decisive and effective action.